Model Making Guru is sponsored by emodels.co.uk. Make something awesome. Okay, so that's these bits all primed and painted and ready. Just got some detail painting to do now. Now, what we've done, I've gone ahead. I say we. I always say we. I don't know why I say we. It's what I've done. What I've done is I've gone ahead and taken the masking off the back wall. We're going to be doing some washes, but not on this back wall, because this is completely covered by decals, so we don't have to do anything on here. No washes, so I can go ahead and take the masking off. If you, for whatever reason, wanted to do some washes on this to bring out recessed detail or something like that, or to do dry brushing later on, you would need to leave the masking on to protect the clear parts, but we're doing none of that. So there you go, clear parts are all ready to go. That's where the light will shine through. We've got some detail painting to do then. We have to get the seats painted up, the rear seats here and the front pilot and co-pilot couch. Wow, there's a throwback to my childhood in the 80s, playing Elite on the BBC Model B. I am that old. So the pilot couches and the rear seats, they need to get painted up. We've got some details to paint on the cockpit. We've got this little area here, which is not covered by a decal, the control yokes, and this little sort of widget down here. Now, I've looked at some shots of the studio filming set of the cockpit of the Falcon, and in the studio shots, that's like a big clear cylinder with blue glowy stuff in it. I don't know what this is meant to be, but it's not particularly accurate, but it looks cool. So we've got to do that. So that, the yokes and that. The rest of that is covered by decal, so we're not fussed. And then there's one other bit we need to paint, which a lot of people don't realise is actually part of the Falcon cockpit. But because you very rarely see it, or it's usually, overlit and you can't tell, this little sort of shelf here is actually a very light off-white bony colour, or like a creamy colour on the studio set. It's not actually grey like the rest of it is. I mean, I say it is. This is based on the photographs I've been able to find of the studio filming set. Either it's really brightly lit and looks really bright, or it's like a light off-white, very light grey colour. So I'm going to paint it an off-white colour anyway. So I'm going to get everything ready. Now for this, we are going to be using a whole host of Vallejo paints. We've got 72061 khaki, 72053 chainmail silver, gunmetal, which is 72054, game colour 72034 bone white, parasite brown 72042, and we have heavy khaki, which is what number is that? 72149. This is the game colour extra opaque. Extra. It's got 100% more opaques in it, and we're going to use an ammo by MIcroSOL, which is a clear colour. It's crystal periscope green. Now, I bet you can't guess what that's for. And then we're going to use some Citadel paints. I've got some Null Oil. Of course, I've got Null Oil. And I've got some Agrax Earth Shade, because of course I've got Agrax Earth Shade. Those are shade paints. They're like washes, basically. Now, we're going to be using the old hairy stick. So get yourself a nice selection of good, fine, pointy brushes for these little bits of detail painting. And one other thing we're going to use, I see we again, it's me, I stopped using the raw we, is my wet palette. You can buy these, I think your models have some in stock. You can get yourself a wet palette, or you can make your own. This is quite simply a plastic container with some kitchen roll, on top of which is a small piece of baking parchment paper. It can't be greaseproof paper, it must be parchment paper, or if you're using if you've bought yourself a wet palette, it's going to be the official wet palette paper. You want parchment paper because it's semi-porous, it'll let water through. Greaseproof paper is waterproof, it'll just resist it and the water won't get through. The whole point of this is that this is something you can put your water-based acrylic paint blobs on, so when you're painting, instead of using a normal palette where the paint dries out, the paint will stay workable on this wet palette for a lot longer. You're not having to waste paint. So if it doesn't matter if you haven't got one. If you haven't got one, just use anything as a palette, doesn't really matter. But if you've got a wet palette, or you can make one, it will just make your life a little easier. So let me go and get everything ready, and we'll do some little bits of painting. Now, I am hoping to be able to show you painting the figures, but it's not guaranteed because I'm an old man. I have to wear the magnifying visor to see tiny things, and that does get in the way of the camera. It makes filming quite difficult, so it may well be that I'm not able to film painting the figures. If so, I do apologise in advance. I'll do my best. If I can, I'll film it, but it might just be not filmable, but we'll see. But I'll definitely film this bit. So let me go and get everything ready, and we shall crack on. Okay, so we're going to start with the chainmail silver, and a couple of little bits of advice for you well, specifically for painting with metallics, and also specifically for painting tiny parts and tiny areas. First of all, when you're painting with metallics, brush painting with metallics, I don't normally recommend you use your wet palette. You can do if you've only got a tiny amount of paint to put on there and it's like going to be used up within minutes because you've only got a small area to paint. It's not so bad. If though you've got a lot of things to paint and you're going to have that metallic paint on that wet palette for days and days, because that's the beauty of a wet palette, and you're going to have a lot of paint on there, you will find that the metallic flakes in that paint will leach into the tissue and the parchment paper and potentially contaminate other paints. Also, over time, the metallic flakes can separate out on the paint and it becomes a bit useless and doesn't really work properly. So unless you've got like the tiniest area and you can use a single drop of paint and that's it, I don't normally recommend a wet palette for these. Just have something else as a palette and just add a tiny amount of water every time you need to, just to keep that paint hydrated on whatever palette you're using. Now the next bit of advice is, it doesn't initially sound logical, and it relates to painting tiny things. If you're painting something super tiny, you might logically think, I'm going to use a super tiny brush to paint this super tiny thing. And I apologize, I'm going to say the word tiny a lot in the next few sentences. That's actually wrong. If you're painting something tiny, you want to use the biggest possible brush. Your brain's going, wait, Fox, what? Have you been on the coffee all day now? Is something gone a bit wrong here? Here's how it works. If you're painting something like really small, logically you're thinking, I want a small brush because then I'm not going to get paint everywhere. If I use a big brush, I'll just cover the whole thing in paint. The problem is, very small brushes have very small paint reservoirs. The way a brush works is the tip of the brush area is where you do your painting. The rest of that brush area is the reservoir for your paint. The smaller that reservoir, the smaller the bulb, I'll call it, that's not the real name, but I'll call it the bulb. The smaller that reservoir, the more often you have to reload the brush. And then you're doing things like paint a small area, reload the brush. Now you're painting another small area, but the paint that was there first is already started drying. So now it's going to react with the paint that's going on it, and it's going to look messy, and you get a lot more texture and brush marks. You're reloading the brush all the time, which is a pain in the bum. What you want to do is go for the biggest feasible brush you can use for the area you need to paint. Now there are two sort of tips here. Make sure you have some decent quality brushes that come to a fine point to do this. And you can see here, this brush I'm using is not the biggest brush in the world, but it's not the smallest brush either. It's about the right size because it gives me a very fine point to paint these little tiny details, which is what I want. But above that fine point is a nice, reasonably fat reservoir of paint, which means I'm not having to reload the brush every 5 strokes. I can get quite a bit painted. And you'll find people that paint miniatures, they do tend to paint these little tiny models with big fat brushes because they don't have to reload them very often. But the point is the trick. It needs to have a real fine, crisp, needle-like point for painting the little tiny areas. So in your brush collection, have a lot of different brushes, round ones, flat ones, frilly ones, old ones for dry brushing, but make sure you've got various sizes of real nice, expensive, pointy brushes for painting those real fine details, but don't always go for the smallest. Sometimes you want the biggest that you can feasibly use. Now I actually waffled for too long there, I didn't get a chance to mention that we're now onto the gunmetal, and all I'm using this for is to paint the 2 little circle areas on the backs of the rear chairs. Now this is the only bits I need to paint metal to start with, and they are tiny and you can't really see it, but they will pop out a bit later on when we do a wash. So just a quick coat of gunmetal on these 2 circular areas. Next up we move on to bone white, and we're going to be painting the 2 shelves, I guess you could call them. Not really armrest areas, somewhere where you might put your cup of coffee. A shelf, let's call it a shelf. The 2 shelves that go down the side. Now, like I say, I've seen these in photographs of the filming studio set, and there's no real evidence as to what colour they are in reality because the photographs are all black and white. So I'm just going for this kind of creamy colour. Anyway, all we're going to do is we're going to get this paint on here, and don't worry just at the moment about getting the straightest possible edge. Try and get a nice clean crisp edge if you can, but don't worry about it too much. Now if you are a beginner and you're taking your first steps into brush painting, a couple of bits of advice for you. First and foremost, as you can see, this is a light colour and you're painting it on top of a very dark base colour underneath it. Typically, light colours tend to be more transparent. If you just put one coat of this over this dark German grey colour, it's going to be streaky and patchy and horrible. When you're painting light over dark, ideally what you want to try and do is avoid that. or at least before you paint this colour on, paint a colour underneath that's fairly opaque and a sort of midway between the dark and the light. But if you can't do that, as I haven't here, just make sure you do 2 or maybe 3 coats of paint to get a nice solid opaque sort of colour. Now, I don't actually need to get that for what I'm doing here, so I'm only going to do a couple of coats. I don't mind if it's a bit streaky because it's going to look worn anyway. But if you're wanting to get a nice solid colour, it's going to take it at least a couple of coats, 2 maybe 3, for various colours. You'll learn over time which colours are more transparent than others. And this brings me on to the second point, which is thinning your paints. When you are brush painting, don't ever take paint straight as it comes out of the pot or from the bottle. You want to thin it slightly, a little bit, just by adding some more. Notice I said thin, not dilute. You want to thin it a little tiny bit just to make it flow better. Now, there are some exceptions. Vallejo Model Air are usually quite thin, and Vallejo True Metals, they're also thin enough that you don't need to dilute them or thin them or anything. They'll just go straight from the container. However, for most colours, most acrylic paints, you want to add a tiny amount of water. Now, if you're using a wet palette, you're probably adding enough water to the paint just by having it on the wet palette. You can go in and take it, but it doesn't harm to get a little tiny bit of water on the brush before you go and scoop some paint out of the wet palette. If you're using a dry palette, you want to add a little bit of water the first time you pick paint from that blob of paint, and then every now and then just to get the paint flowing. This does 2 things. First of all, it helps reduce brush marks. If you paint straight from the pot or the paint as it comes out of the bottle, you're going to get brush marks because it's thick and gloopy, especially the Vallejo model colours. The other thing it does is it thins the paint slightly, so when you paint it on, it looks a bit transparent. You do multiple coats like that, it then builds the colour up, but you avoid the brush marks. If I took this colour straight from the bottle and just slapped it on there, did 3 coats, it will be lumpy and bumpy and be covered in nonsense. Because I'm thinning it with a little bit of water from the wet palette and a little bit of extra from the brush, it goes on nice and smooth, and although it's transparent, because it's smooth, I can do multiple coats. So the trick is always do multiple coats, but thin the paint and build it up slowly. Don't try and get a solid opaque colour straight away just by taking it straight from the pot. That will just look rubbish. If there's only ever one thing you remember about brush painting, it is the golden rule: thin your paints. There you go. Okay, that's the first lot of base colours down. Now, it's not everything. There are some other colours that we're going to need to put on, but we've got some steps to do in between. Like, for example, there's more paint to put on these seats, but we need to do some other stuff first. It's all about planning. Now, the paint job you'll see, if you could see it in real life, you see this is not the best paint job. It's reasonably straight edged. I did tidy it up a little bit, but it's a bit patchy. It's not exactly a solid coat of colour. Same with the seats here. You can see in a few places a little bit of a hint of the colour underneath showing through. Now, if this was a regular paint job, I'd be doing more coats to block that out. However, 2 important things. First of all, this is supposed to be a ship that's 90 to 100 years old. It's got, some wear and tear. It's a hunk of junk, as we know from the dialogue. It's supposed to be battered and worn. If you're painting this as factory fresh just from the factory and it's just come out of the Corellian, shipyards, yeah, you'd probably want to get everything looking nice and pristine and big, thick coats of paint so there was nothing showing through. But I don't want that. There's a certain way in which, there's a certain sort of degree to which you can use the way paint behaves to benefit you and to save you some work. I want this to look a bit worn and faded. So therefore, why not just do 3 coats of paint so it's still a little bit patchy and not 5 coats of paint, which is solid. It helps do some work for you. So don't always think you've got to get the colours nice and neat. If you're doing something weathered and worn, you don't have to. So it's a little bit patchy by design, but we're going to do a step now because the next step we're going to do is actually going to fix, for example, the wibbly wobbly edge there. If you're new to painting by brush and you're not quite familiar with it, don't worry so much about wibbly wobbly edges like that. Two things. First of all, this bit of dashboard here, it looks like I've hacked it around with a knife. It's not. That's how it's come off the sprue. It's actually a bit weird. It's like a bit gnarly. I don't know if it's like a mismold from Bandai or it's supposed to represent something, but it just looks a bit rough and ready. It's really weird. It's like I've hacked it with a knife, but I haven't. But second of all, we're going to do a wash. And a wash is going to basically make all the sort of joints between two colours, like you've got this light colour and the dark colour. Anywhere you've brushed up against a corner edge and it's a little bit wobbly, it's going to hide those sins. Now, a wash is not something you'd always do, but if you are planning on doing a wash, or as Games Workshop call it, a shade, it will hide the sins of wibbly wobbly, not straight lines. So what we're going to do, dead easy. I'm going to film this in one take, that's how easy it is. You can make your own washes, you can just use thin down paint, but for this I'm actually going to use Citadel's Nuln Oil. If you're going to make your own washes, it depends what you want to achieve, but I would recommend, rather than just taking your paint and some water or some thinner and making a thin wash, I would recommend making, if you're using acrylics, using a medium like Lamian Medium or Vallejo's Glaze Medium. These are basically paints without pigment. Rather than thinning the paint with water or thinners, why not dilute it with medium? It'll still behave like the paint, but it will be more transparent. Because what I want to do is I want to tint the surface a little bit, but I want it to collect in the recesses and give some depth to them, and also, you know, the boundaries between two colours. For example, on the dashboard here, on the instrument panel, I want it to, you know, unbrighten these silver bits a little bit and go into all the recesses and give it some depth. But I don't want it to paint it. I want it to disappear into the recesses and only tint it a little bit. If you thin your paint, it might go around the edges, but it'll also give you sort of little tide marks and weird little lines and squiggles. It won't be as nice and neat. If you thin your paint with a medium, like Lamian Medium or Glaze Medium, or if you just use a Citadel shade, then it behaves more like a paint, but it doesn't give you watermarks and stuff. It's kind of hard to explain, but on this kind of tiny little parts, it probably doesn't really matter, but let's just get this done anyway. So we've got our shade here. I do recommend with any of these shades or paints, get something that you can use to lock your paint in place so it doesn't fall over. Especially if you spill shades, they're a nightmare to get off your workbench. So yeah, just get a piece of blue tack. I've got over here, I've got a wooden placemat with some blue tack on it that I can plonk things on, or like I did before with that little plastic lid there, you know, just something to mount your thing on so you can't spill it. So anyway, so what we're going to do, so it's a shade. You could have made your own wash, however you want to do it. Get yourself a nice big brush, and all we're going to do is quite simple. We're going to get some of the shade, and we're just going to
slap it on.
Exactly, Ted. We're just going to slap it on. This is designed to just be slapped on. Now, a lot of this is going to get covered up by the decals, but I'll put it on anyway. And it's part of the reason why we painted this whole thing a dark grey colour and not just black, is because if you paint something black straight off, then you can't apply any shade to it. You can't make any recesses darker because they're already dark because they're black. If you go and have something that you want to be dark or possibly black, and the best thing to do is to simply do it a dark grey and then add a wash to it to darken down the recesses. So that's enough of that. I'm going to leave that to one side. I always use gravity to your advantage. I've got it on a stick so I can mount it like that on a piece of foam, and it will pull the paint down. So there's that one. I'll get the next one. One other thing as well, always make sure you shake your shades vigorously. Now for these parts, I'm not going to do the... I'm going to do the black shade. I'm going to do the black shade, but I'm only doing it down here. And I'll show you why in a minute. I don't want to put this sort of dark black shade on the railing here, because I don't want that to look like it's got a black wash in it. I'll use a different colour wash for that. I don't know if that's visible, so I'll do that. But I want it to be down here, so it can collect it in the corners. And you'll see, you might see eventually when it dries off, you might see it. It might not come out on camera. I want it to just give a dirty effect, but I don't want it to go on there because we'll sort that out. This bit I don't really need to do because this is going to have decals on it, so I don't need to worry about the top bit. It's mostly going to be covered by decals. So we'll do the same on this one. We'll just go down to the lower areas. And again, the trick with the shade or your own wash, if you've made a wash with a medium and not just with thin paint, is to just get it on there, be generous. Don't let it pool up. If I put a big dot of it in and it made a big blob of paint there, then when it dried off of this shade, it would be like a physical lump. You'd see it and it would look horrible. So if you do get a pool of paint, just move it around a little bit just to avoid it. Also, you know, keep it out of joints and things as well. You don't want it to pool up. I'll just double check this one, make sure we've not got any pooling. Yeah, there's a little bit down in that corner there, so I'll just drag it out and move it around somewhere else. If I need to, I can wipe some of it off on a piece of tissue. There we go. And this black shade, this Null Oil, is a dark sort of bluey black shade. This will tone everything down and make it look a bit oily and used. Now, what I'm going to do on this chair, if you look at these chairs in real life in the filming studio set, in the full-size set, these are actually sort of metal painted black and then battered and beaten. I'm just going to do it as a shade over the grey. Again, if you paint it black, you can't put a shade on it or a wash. So we do it as dark grey first. We then do the black wash over the top. I'm not going to worry about the back of them because you don't see that anyway. The black wash can go into all the recesses and give it some three-dimensionality. And then we can come back with some of the processes later on. We've still got to do the cushions and stuff yet, so I'll do down the side because you might be able to see that side. But notice I'm not worrying about the cushions and things. There we go. So yes, if you want to paint something that's meant to be very dark or black, don't just paint it black. Because you can't go anywhere from that. You can do a highlight, but you can't do any low lights, and that's what this shade will do. Or if you make a wash, that's what the wash will do. It'll go into all the little recesses and it'll move away from any raised areas and it'll go down into the recesses and make it look more three-dimensional. You see on these silver bits here that I painted gunmetal. When I painted them just as they are, it was hard to see them. You didn't really see them on camera. But now there's a shade on here. It's going round the recesses and into those little grooves and pulls away from the flat surface, and it just makes them pop out a little bit more and look a bit dirty. So we'll put them there. Now what I'm going to do with these is actually put them that way around, because I want the shade to collect in the recesses. They're going to light on the back, as it were. And for these, for the pilot couch and the co-pilot couch, I'm not going to put any on the chair. I need to touch up a little bit there. I've got some of the khaki on the dark grey, but that's fine. I can touch it up later. I'm just putting this on the bits that are meant to be dark grey, so the bits that are supposed to be like the parts of the cockpit. Now I'll do the backs anyway, but you're not really going to see these because you can't see that into the back of the cockpit. But for the sake of consistency, I shall do the backs of those. Okay. Right, so that's that bit. Again, if you are new to brush painting and you are, painting stuff, never be afraid if you go slip and make a little bit. Like I've got some of the khaki just there on the corner. Not a problem. I can clean it up later. It's fine. It doesn't really matter. Ultimately, if everything all goes to pot completely, you can always strip it down and repaint it. So that's that bit done. I shall put that there. Now, we're not going to do the back wall because that's going to have decals all over it. You're not going to see any of that, so I don't need to worry about the back wall. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to let that dry for about 20 minutes, and then when we come back, we shall have the next step. Okay, for the next step, we're going to use another shade from Citadel. It's Agrax Earth Shade. Now again, if you haven't got this, don't panic. E-models don't have this in stock just yet, either of these, but they will be getting them shortly. So by the time you're watching this, they'll probably have them in. But if you haven't got this, don't worry. A very good alternative would be some Vallejo Sepia ink with a bit of the Vallejo Glaze Medium in, which is basically very similar. It's not quite the same colour. It's not as warm as this one, but it's a sort of browny wash kind of effect. So again, if you can make a wash with a Glaze Medium, or a medium as it's sometimes called, rather than just thinning it with thinners, it's much better. Now we're going to use this on these two seats, and we're going to use it on this sort of shelf bit here. Now it doesn't matter that the other wash hasn't quite dried yet, that's fine, it doesn't really matter. So we're going to get this on here. And for this one, same again, exactly the same principle. We're just going to take the shade, or in wash, or whatever you're using, get some on the brush, and for this we are just going to quite simply generously paint it all over the seat here. It's going to do exactly the same as the Null Oil. It's going to collect in the recesses and really bring those out, but also it'll sort of tint and stain the rest of the seat as well, and just give it a bit more depth and three-dimensionality. Now again, you need to make sure it doesn't pool up anywhere. So as I'm going around, I'm just making sure it's not collecting down here in this little recess anywhere. Because again, if this stuff like the null oil, if it, or whatever shade, if you use a wash of your own that you've made yourself, if it does pool up and collect, it'll just make a lump, which will look horrible, but it'll also get in the way of the figure when you're trying to jam the figure in the seat. It won't quite fit. So just go on and get this in. And don't worry if you're going over a bit of the grey area, it's absolutely fine. At the end of the day, you're making something that looks a bit grubby and dirty. That's fine. Don't worry if things overlap. If you get a bit of colour here and there, that's absolutely fine. So I'm going to leave that for about 10 minutes just to dry a little bit. And I'll probably do a second coat to darken it down even more. And for the little shelves here, what I'm going to do is quickly run this along the shelf like that. Now remember how I said about using washes and shades to hide your sins? Do you see how it's collected along the edge there? I hope you can on camera. Do you see how it's collected along the edge there? When it dries, it looks a bit harsh now, but when it's dried, most paints as they dry, they become more transparent and a little lighter. They lighten up a little bit. This will blend away a little bit, and you won't really see it on the dark grey, but you will see it on the tan colour. But it will also help smooth that edge, and when it's dried, it'll look like you've painted a beautiful straight line of edge of the tan colour, when of course you haven't. And that's the thing, if you're making a model, if you're new to brush painting, if you are painting an edge, doesn't matter what you're making, it could be a tank, it could be a plane, it could be anything. If you're brush painting and you're painting an edge and you're really struggling to get that nice crisp line, if part of your process later on is to do a wash to bring out details, then that will hide those sins. Especially if you're painting like minis, painting your Space Marines or your, whatever, your Tau or your whatever, Necrons or something, or any kind of, D&D minis. Especially on minis where it's all brush painting, sometimes you'll get different parts of the armour. Like on a Space Marine, you might get the gold trim around the pauldron, and the pauldron might be a different colour, and you might not be able to get that edge quite straight because the moulding's a bit soft. Don't worry, a shade will just clean that up completely. It will just eliminate all your sins. So I'll show you that again when it's dry, but that is how washes and shades hide a multitude of sins. And when you hear me say shade, just because you'll have heard people use the word shades, it's just a wash. It's just a wash. Games Workshop make it pre-made, and like I say, e-models don't have this in right now, but they will be getting the entire paint range in very, very soon. So like I say, right now when I'm filming this, they don't have that, but by the time you're watching this, weeks from now or whenever it comes out, they'll probably have them all in. And if they haven't, just drop them a note and say, when are you getting the paints in? But like I say, Vallejo have got lots of equivalents. They have a black ink that you can mix with Vallejo acrylic medium to make null. They have a sepia tint. I think it's an ink. Is it an ink? I can't remember now. It's a very transparent sepia colour that you can mix with Glaze Medium, again, to make Agrax Earth shade. So, and I knocked the microphone then, I do apologise. That probably deafened you. So yes, go for it. Anyway, that's those bits. I'm not going to do a second coat on those shelves, but I will do a second coat on the chair. Let me give that a couple of minutes, and I'll let that dry, and we'll do a second coat. Okay, so you can see the kind of effect that wash has had on there, that shade. So we're going to do another one because we want to take it down a notch and further. We want to make it a little bit darker still. So I'm going to go back in, give it a good shake. Always shake your washes and shades. With Agrax Earth shade specifically, if you don't shake it, it comes out glossy. Now there is a separate gloss Agrax Earth shade, but with this stuff it does come out glossy if you don't shake it. So shake it, shake your shades. Right, so we're going to do exactly the same again. Get some of the shade on the brush, and we're just going to do a second coat. And this is just to darken it even more. Not necessarily to darken the recesses, although it will do that, but also just to darken the whole of the seat cushion itself. You'll see how, although it does collect in the recesses, it also does tint the sort of raised surface a little bit, and you want that as well. It just darkens things down. So I'll just make sure it doesn't pool too much in the recesses, otherwise my figures will never go in. And there we go, a couple of shade coats later, and it's looking a bit more three-dimensional, solid. It's looking a bit better. Still got a little bit of work left to do, and the next step for the whole of the cockpit is the dry brushings. We need to do some dry brushing on the seats, the sort of the bulkheads and stuff in the cockpit. Now I know a lot of these are going to be covered up with decals, but we're going to dry brush them anyway, because you never know what bits might show. And we've got some to do on these seats. Still work to do after that on these seats, but the dry brushing is the next step. So I did say before, it's worth, when you're painting these things, plan each step so you know what you're doing. For example, I can't paint the seat cushions till I've done the dry brushing on these seats. Otherwise, I'll paint the seat cushions and then just dry brush over them, which would be brilliant. So plan things in order. We're going to dry brush with a few colours. We are going to dry brush with the 72149 Heavy Khaki Game Extra Opaque. We've got some Vallejo model colour 70992, neutral grey, and we're probably going to use chainmail silver again for the metallics. So we're going to do the khaki first. As with all paints, give them a darn good shake. Right, where's my little, there it is. A divisor of plastic. We don't use the wet palette for this. If you're dry brushing, use a wet palette if you're brushing. If you're dry brushing, as the name suggests, it needs to be dry, not wet. So a wet palette would not be ideal. So you want to get yourself a nice brush. I've got, for this, I've got a Citadel base brush, which I find them really great for dry brushing. If you've never, and I do dry brushing all the time, so I'm sure you know what I'm about to do. What you do is you get some paint on your brush. You don't need a whole mess of paint, just a small amount. Just get a bit on the tip like that. Make sure it works in between the bristles. I'll put that to one side. And then what you do is you take your brush and you get most of that off on a piece of kitchen roll or tissue. I wouldn't recommend toilet roll because that tends to go fluffy and bitty, but kitchen roll is quite good. So you get a lot of the paint off, and all we're going to do now is we're going to dry brush it, which means just basically going over this very lightly without making it fall off the stick, so that the paint is picked up on all the edges. Now there's different ways of doing dry brushing, as you'll see in a moment, but for this particular one I want it to collect on the edges. And this is a slightly lighter shade. It's not massively lighter, but it's a little bit lighter, and hopefully what it'll do is it'll get picked up on the raised bits, but it'll stay dark in the recesses. And I want it to kind of go where there'd be more wear and tear, like on the edges of seats. You know, people are getting in and out of the seat all the time. They're going to put the hands on the sides. They're going to scuff the front here. Oh, I won't just take that off. It's a lot easier. Okay, now it could still be with the words. It could still do with being a little bit lighter. So we'll probably come in with a second dry brush coat in a moment. Okay, so there we go. That's that layer done. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to come back in with the bone white we had earlier on, which is the 72034. Bone white. Bone. Don't know what that means. Don't know where that came from. I'm not going to clean the brush. With dry brushing, it's all about getting messy. Don't worry about it. Get a bit of paint on the brush. Same again as last time. Put that there. Get most of the paint off on the brush. Don't be afraid to mix and match colours actually on the piece while you're doing it. It's absolutely fine. For this, I want to go even lighter. I just want to really pick out the edges where there'd be real wear and tear. So headrests. Now the beauty of using something like this base brush and using a flicking motion is that you get little tiny brush marks, little lines that if it was a metallic colour would be like little tiny scrapes. But on something like a chair like this that's leathery or fabricy, it looks like just wear and tear patterns. So I'll do a little bit on the butt area where the person butt would go, or the tubally backer butt would go. There we go. And it just lightens it up a little bit. Just around the top of the headrest there. Now in reality, of course, once this goes into the cockpit, you will never ever see it. Try to do a bit more. You won't see it. It'll go dark, even with the lighting, because the lighting doesn't really light the cockpit. It's not like a full massive lighting up all the twinklies and things. It really is just that light at the back of the cockpit. Aftermarket third-party lighting kits are available that do a lot more lighting, but it's pretty good for what you get. You know, standard in the kit. And there we go. I think that's about done. What's the next step? Next, we need to do we need to wash the brush off. Now, the thing is with a dry brush, try and have more than one brush, because now I've washed that brush off or rinsed it off, I can't use that brush for dry brushing again now. So I happen to have, let's see what the good doctor has in his magic bag. I happen to have a bigger dry brush. And now we're going to do the bulkheads. Now again, this may seem a little weird that we're about to dry brush the bulkheads when they're going to be mostly covered with decals, but it's just about planning for the unexpected, like where there might be a little gap in the decals, and also some of it isn't covered by decals. So we're going to use the neutral grey 70992. Oh, and it's just exploding out of the bottle. There you go. If you use these base brushes from Citadel, once they get a bit old and worn and they lose their point, they are great little dry brushes. They are fantastic. So, same again. We've got, I'll start with the big one first. We've got our grey colour. Where's my big brush? There we go. So we'll just get some of the paint on the brush. Okay, you don't need to get a lot of the paint. You don't need to go all the way up the brush. Just get the tips of the bristles in there. Make sure it's between the bristles. Get it off on the tissue. And this isn't a massively lighter colour. And the point of this is really twofold. We want it to pick up the edges, but also, really, we want to get a bit of variation. We've darkened it down with the shade. Now we want to kind of make some edges pop out. I don't know how much of this floor will be visible, you see. Make some edges pop out. But in this case, like on the chair, we're going just for the edges. With this, I want to lighten the centres of the panels. So if you use a circular motion very lightly, what you can do is you can add little highlights to areas. I don't know if it'll come out on camera, but you can just give a slight variation effect. It just makes it look, as well as picking out the edges, which it does anyway, it also just gives it a slight worn effect. And the trick is to use, I'll do it, I'm going to cover this with a decal, but I'll demonstrate it here. If you use circular motions, if you do it flicky like that, you'll get the edges. If you do circular motions, you go very gently, with almost no paint on there, then very slowly you can build up a highlight. I'm running out of paint on the brush there, I've got that little on there. It just means you've not got a solid flat colour. And my real focus here is on the floor rather than anywhere else. And I'm going to do a little bit on the back wall because I don't think the decal goes all the way. And I'll pick out some of this edge here just to give it some wear and tear. Now, like I said, remember, this is a 100-year-old ship, but it's supposed to be, so it's not going to be nice and neat and tidy. Let's do the next one. Bit of paint. Dry brushing is great fun. If you've never done dry brushing, you need to learn how to do it. It's also, if you haven't got an airbrush, dry brushing can also be a fantastic way to get pre-shading effects without being able to pre-shade. You can get real blending and fading and stuff without having an airbrush. So again, just going to go with flicky motion to start with, just to pick up the edges. And then once I've taken some of the paint off the brush, I can go in with the circular motion.